History prefers clean origin stories. One invention, one decree, one villain. So the caste system is often explained like this. Ancient India created four groups. Those groups hardened. Inequality followed. Simple, memorable. Wrong in the ways that matter. Because the caste system did not suddenly become rigid, it slowly tightened. And it tightened during a period of enormous change. To understand why it became more rigid in the later Vedic period, we have to go back to the early Vedic world, a world that was smaller, looser, more fluid than we imagine. In the early Vedic period, society revolved around semi-nomadic pastoral tribes. Cattle were wealth. Ritual fire altars were political centers. Identity mattered, but it was not yet locked in stone. The four Varnas, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, were mentioned, but they were not yet an all-encompassing social prison. They were categories, ideals, descriptions of function more than destiny. Priests conducted rituals, warriors fought, commoners farmed and traded, servile groups labored. But the lines were not as frozen as they would later become. Texts from the early period suggest mobility. Intermarriage was not yet unthinkable. Occupation could shift. Then the world changed. Between roughly 1000 BCE and 600 BCE, the Vedic people expanded eastward from the Punjab into the fertile Gangetic plains. This was not a minor migration, it was a transformation. Forests were cleared, iron tools spread, agriculture intensified, permanent settlements replaced temporary camps, and with permanent settlement came something powerful: surplus. Surplus changes everything. It creates inequality, it creates specialization, it creates the need to manage, justify, and stabilize hierarchy. As agriculture deepened, land became more valuable than cattle. Control over territory mattered more than seasonal movement. Lineage hardened. Inheritance became crucial. When land becomes central, purity of descent becomes political. Who owns it? Who inherits it? Who is allowed to marry into it? The more property matters, the more social boundaries tighten. At the same time, rituals grew more complex. The famous sacrificial ceremonies described in later Vedic texts became elaborate, expensive, and symbolically dense. Kings required priests. Priests required patronage. This mutual dependence elevated the Brahmins. Their knowledge of sacred hymns and ritual precision became a specialized skill, not easily replaced, not easily shared. Knowledge became power, and power prefers to reproduce itself. As rituals expanded, the idea of ritual purity became sharper. Who could perform a sacrifice? Who could hear the sacred chants? Who could touch the altar? Exclusion was not random, it was systematized. The later Vedic texts began to articulate clearer social distinctions. Dharma, duty, was increasingly framed as specific to one's varna, not just what you did, but what you were meant to do. This shift from functional role to inherited obligation is crucial. When duty becomes birth-based, flexibility shrinks. Political centralization also played a role. Small tribal assemblies gave way to larger kingdoms. The authority of kings expanded. Standing armies grew. Taxation intensified. A larger state requires order, predictability, stable categories. Rigid social divisions help rulers know who owes what, who serves, who pays, who fights. Social fluidity is difficult to administer. Hierarchy is easier to tax. There was also cultural anxiety. As Vedic society moved eastward, it encountered diverse populations, communities with different languages, rituals, and traditions. Incorporation was possible, but incorporation required classification. New groups were often slotted into the existing framework, usually at the bottom. Varna became a tool of absorption, but absorption reinforced hierarchy. When a society expands, it often strengthens boundaries to protect identity. The more contact, the more concern about purity. The more mixing, the more rules about mixing. Endogamy, marriage within one's group, tightened. Commensability rules hardened. Ritual distance became socially visible. And once marriage rules harden, rigidity accelerates. Because marriage determines the next generation. Texts from the later Vedic period show increasing discomfort with mixed unions. Children of such unions were classified carefully, catalogued, ranked. What began as flexible categories slowly turned into a layered map of inherited status. But ideology mattered as much as economics. The famous Purusha Sukta hymn describes society as emerging from a cosmic being. Brahmins from the mouth, Kshatriyas from the arms, Vaishyas from the thighs, Shudras from the feet. It is poetic, it is symbolic, it is also political, because it frames hierarchy as divine, not accidental, not negotiable. When social order is linked to cosmic order, dissent becomes sacrilege. Later Vedic thinkers increasingly connected social duty to universal balance. Each group had its place. Each place had moral weight. This is not simply oppression, it is metaphysical justification. And metaphysical systems are resilient. The rise of new urban centers towards the end of the Vedic age added another layer. Trade expanded, craft specialization increased, guild-like communities formed. Occupational groups began to solidify into more endogamous units. What later generations would call jatis were beginning to take shape. Varna was the theory, jati was the lived reality, and lived reality is always more granular. As occupations became hereditary, social boundaries aligned with economic roles. If your father was a metalworker, you learned metalwork. If your mother was a ritual lineage, you inherited ritual identity. Over time, repetition becomes norm. Norm becomes rule. Law becomes rule. Legal and ethical texts that followed in later centuries would codify these distinctions even more strongly. But the groundwork was laid in the later Vedic age. None of this happened overnight. There was no council meeting where rigidity was declared. There was no single law that froze society. Instead, there were pressures: agricultural expansion, political consolidation, ritual specialization, cultural encounter, property inheritance. Each one pulled the system tighter, and once tightened, it resisted loosening. It's important to understand that rigidity often grows out of attempts to manage complexity. The later Vedic world was more complex than the early one. More land, more people, more wealth, more diversity. Complexity demands structure. Structure can become hierarchy, and hierarchy can become hereditary. And heredity is the enemy of mobility. By the end of the later Vedic period, the idea that one's social position was determined by birth gained strength. It was reinforced by ritual, defended by theology, stabilized by property, enforced by marriage norms. What began as a flexible social taxonomy hardened into a moral order. But even then, it was not absolute. Resistance existed, alternative philosophies emerged. Urban movements in the centuries that followed would question ritual dominance. The story is not one of inevitability, it is one of accumulation. Small shifts, repeated patterns, institutional reinforcement. Rigidity rarely is born in a moment. It crystallizes.